I'm very excited for our next session. I'm Margaret Walton-Roberts. I'm from Professor at Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario, and I'm the Migration, Mobility and Integration co-lead on the Canadian Health Workforce Network. So I'm really pleased about this next session that we have planned. We'll be looking at panel 3 at ethical recruitment and integration. We're particularly interested in this theme. For those of you who were here yesterday, you will have noted that in a number of our discussions on health workforce planning, that international recruitment played an important role in terms of fixing some of the gaps that exist. And clearly, we need to pay much more attention to what's happening in this space. Especially since in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a renewed interest in the international recruitment of health professionals. And so for this session, we have some stellar presenters who are going to share their work with us. We have 4 presenters. Each of them will be invited to make a presentation for about 12 minutes. And then at the end, we'll save questions for the end. And the way in which this is going to work will be moving from, I'm a geographer, so I do enjoy working through kind of spatial scales. And so we're going to begin at the international scale. We're going to hear from Mukul Bakhshi, who is the Chief Global Affairs Officer from CGFNS. And he'll be talking about some of the international patterns that they have identified. Then we'll be hearing from Polly Pittman, who's Professor of Health Policy and Management and Director of the Health Workforce Research Center at George Washington University. She'll be looking at some interesting issues that have emerged in the USA with regards to the ethical recruitment of, and the majority of our panelists will be talking about internationally educated nurses, but she'll be looking at some recent and not so recent legal cases that really speak to some of these ethical issues. Then joining us from the UK is James Buchan, who is the Senior Fellow with the Health Foundation, and he'll be taking us through some recent data from the UK. And then our final presenter, last but not least, of course, is Ruth Lee, who's the Executive Director of CARE, Centre for Internationally Educated Nurses, Toronto, Canada. And she'll talk about some interesting work that they conduct. They're more like practitioners working with internationally educated nurses in terms of bridging into the profession. And so that will kind of round out this panel and give us a very interesting kind of global review on some of these issues. So as I mentioned, I'll hand it over to each presenter and invite them to speak for about 12 minutes. And we'll start with Mukul. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Margaret. And thank you all for being here. Sorry I'm not with you in Ottawa today, but look forward to making it up there at some point. I think we have a really great panel discussion today and very much looking forward to kind of dissecting some of the nuances of ethical recruitment and what that means in integration as we move forward. My name is Mukul Bakhshi. As Margaret mentioned, I'm the Chief Global Affairs Officer at CGFNS. I'm also the Director of a division of CGFNS known as the Alliance for Ethical International Recruitment Practices. I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A today, but you also have my email address if you'd like to follow up offline. For those of you who don't know CGFNS, it is a leading credentials evaluation organization in the healthcare professions. We've been around since 1977, and really what we do as an organization is enable professionals to bring and use their experience and education across borders. And so we do that by being a kind of a key part of either the licensure or immigration processes for nurses and other health professionals who are looking to work and live in the US, Canada through the National Nursing Assessment Service, and New Zealand. And we processed over 4 million applications from over 190 countries. And so if you think of CGFNS as really being this organization that serves as a gateway to enable healthcare professionals to bring and use their experience across borders, the Alliance Division, which has been part of CGFNS since 2014 and which Polly led the effort to develop it back in 2008, is trying to make sure that happens fairly and ethically. And so we at the Alliance ensure that recruitment and employment practices are fair, ethical, and transparent as defined by our voluntary code. So as Margaret mentioned, I want to first talk a little bit about some data. We just released our 2023 nurse migration report at CGFNS this week. It provides a lot of global context, but it also includes our data on our US programs, particularly our visa screen service, which is a requirement for immigration to the United States, and our credentials evaluation service, which is a report that we issue to state boards of nursing for licensure. And so the report is really aimed at kind of filling this major data gap around internationally educated nurses and providing some insight into migration tools. And so the data story here is an example in the United States, but really you see a lot of this around the world, and it shows kind of a major increase specifically around people applying for our visa screen service. And as I mentioned a moment ago, to get an immigration visa as an occupational visa to come to the United States based on your employment status, you do need a visa screen certificate or a health worker certificate. And those numbers have increased quite markedly. So just since 2022, fiscal year 2022, there's been a 49% increase, and essentially the numbers have more than tripled since 2018. And the real key here is that in the last couple of years, a lot more visas were available to come to the United States, and that was because a lot of the visa categories that are for family visas and other occupations weren't used during the pandemic for a variety of reasons, and so those rolled over into the overall category that could then be used by healthcare workers. But in 2024, which the federal fiscal year just started in October, those numbers have gone back to normal. So there's going to be a real kind of reckoning around what visa categories look like in the future, as demand has been incredibly strong for health workers. I want to note also that the United States is a bit different than a lot of countries, including Canada, the UK, New Zealand, other kind of traditional destination countries. In the last couple of years, with the pandemic and kind of acute healthcare worker shortages, a lot of countries have tried to attract nurses and other healthcare professionals. New Zealand recently established kind of automatic residency for nurses coming there. Countries have kind of rolled out the welcome mat, so to speak, to get health workers to come there. The US really hasn't had any changes to its immigration policies. Nonetheless, it's still a very attractive target for many people to come to. In terms of what are these health worker categories we're talking about, the vast majority are nurses. 85%, in fact, are nurses. Most of the rest are clinical laboratory scientists, also known as med techs. And then the other kind of allied professions like physical therapists and occupational therapists are a really small portion here. The other thing I want to note is that most of those visa screen applicants are coming for permanent employment-based green card visas. So most of them are really looking for long-term residency in the United States. And the other reason why this is really important is because the structure of when people come to the United States, being a green card means that you basically have carte blanche after you're there to move around. And so some of the contract practices we're going to talk about and the issues around ethical recruitment are really because of the visa structure in the United States, both in terms of the cost of visas, in terms of delays, in terms of timing, and all those things all kind of have implications downstream in terms of how nurses are treated. The other categories I want to mention are the H-1B visa. This is really often known as a tech worker visa, but can be a category particularly for advanced practice nurses and allied professionals. And finally, the TN visa. The TN visa is really important in the Canadian context because, of course, the TN category refers to US, Mexico, and Canada, and the agreement there. So a lot of Canadian nurses in particular work in the United States under that pathway. In terms of where people are coming from, as you can expect, the Philippines is a major category. Some of the African countries have increased in the last couple of years. Of course, nurses educated in Canada and in the United States who need a visa screen because they need an occupational visa, that's another major source. One thing that's missing here that I want to note is India. India, of course, is a major source country for nurses around the world, but because of US visa laws and kind of per country caps, there are kind of over 10-year waits for nurses who want to come to the United States from India. I also want to note that the number of nurses from Canada increased quite a lot. There was a 27% increase just in the last year for nurses from Canada. As US wage rates jumped during the pandemic, a lot of Canadian nurses sought to come to the United States. So shifting to kind of the economics of nurse migration, this is another report we issued last summer. We did a survey, and one of the things that's notable is that, of course, the U.S. has higher wages than many other countries, of course, source countries, but even a lot of destination countries like Canada and the UK, the wages are much higher in the U.S. In fact, the average was around $66,000 in our survey. And another thing I want to note is that one of the key drivers here is that remittances are quite common. In fact, 65% of immigrant nurses to the United States send some money home, with some of the African countries being the ones with the largest percentage of nurses paying remittances. And as you might expect, some of the drivers here are familial, professional, and economic. All of those are drivers for people to come to the United States. And we're talking about significant costs, up to $5,000 in direct costs just to come to the US. And that is why a lot of people choose to use recruiters. About 52%, in fact, use a recruiter to come to the United States. And of those, 55% of them are certified by the Alliance for Ethical International Recruitment Practices. In terms of the pathways, I know Polly's going to get a bit more into this. There are kind of three pathways. One is direct recruitment. This is when a nurse is directly recruited by a hospital's HR system. The next is the placement firm model. This is where a third-party recruiter recruits, but the hospital is the one that actually employs them and signs the contract with them. And the final one is the staffing firm model. This is the most common model. This is one where the staffing firm is the employer, then they contract out workers to the US, to the hospital to work during that term. In this case, the contract is typically around 3 years or so, and the staffing firm may redeploy nurses throughout the time of the contract. One thing I want to note is that I used to think there might be benefits to, say, direct hire or placement firms. And what I've realized over time is that there are pros and cons in terms of ethical recruitment for each of the models. So, for example, with the placement firms, with the Alliance process, we've been able to have oversight over the placement firm. But if the actual healthcare facility is unresponsive or isn't helpful, there's less that can be done. And so it's important to recognize that ethical recruitment really needs to involve all the stakeholders, the recruiter and the employer. And some of the issues that arise, one, of course, is information asymmetry. This just means that a nurse generally knows a lot less when they're coming over than the employer does. This is a regular in any kind of employer relationship between someone looking for a job and someone who has a job. But it's really critical here because obviously, if you're an immigrant, you have much less context, and sometimes you don't even know where you'll be working or how long it will take to get there. There are issues around exploitation and trafficking, particularly around some of the cost and duration. If you have a multi-year contract and you leave it, sometimes the breach fees could be in the tens of thousands of dollars, and there could be issues around what that means for you and potentially leaving you in vulnerable situations. And then over recruitment. This is kind of the global context where you want to be careful that recruitment does not unduly exacerbate healthcare shortages in a home country. Other issues that we often see, in our kind of alliance review period, location issues, where you're going to be working, do they force you to move over time? Bench pay, what happens if you don't have a job for a short time in a staffing model? Does that mean you're just kind of out of luck and have to fend for yourself? The length of the contract, making sure you have sufficient cultural and clinical orientation. This gets to some of the integration issues I know we're going to talk about. Having a job that's aligned with your skills and kind of progression for your career. And then, as I mentioned, breach fees and what that means. So as I mentioned, the Alliance is kind of the multi-stakeholder organization incorporating recruiters, unions, employers that kind of finds common ground around best practices for recruitment. And one of the goals here is to make sure that health professionals really understand what their obligations and rights are. And so we really lay out what are your rights and responsibilities, what are recruiters supposed to do, the right to access justice, the right to move freely, and then support for clinical and cultural orientation. And so we certify the recruiters, we try to educate nurses and other health professionals about their rights, and we disseminate research about what is out there. And so with that, I want to kind of highlight kind of three pieces here that's important. One is the Alliance. Of course, we have an application, we survey nurses, and we do a comment period. We have an employment contract that we review carefully from the staffing firm, and so we can make sure that that contract complies with our code. But I think what I want to close with is kind of a couple issues. So one is, I know Polly's going to talk a bit about lawsuits, and there's kind of a symbiosis between the Alliance's voluntary model and some of the kind of a legal or legislative approach, in that those things can kind of help push the Alliance code forward in terms of roles and responsibilities and getting firms to choose to get certified. The other thing I want to mention is that there's kind of no panaceas here. As I mentioned, some of the models that I thought were more appealing, as they've kind of risen the last couple of years, we've seen kind of additional problems arise. And I think one of the key requirements that we have to think about is assuring that there are kind of fair and ethical pathways that allow people to get the support they need to come to work, and recognizing that there are trade-offs involved. So with that, thank you so much for listening. Looking forward to my panelists to speak and robust Q&A. Thank you.
Excellent. Great, thank you so much for that. Mukul, we're going to move now to actually look a little bit more in detail about some of these issues about the type of recruitment processes in the US. And so I'll hand it over to Professor Polly Pittman, who will talk to us about those issues. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to be addressing you from afar, and nice to see old friends on the panel as well. So some of what I'm going to cover is duplicative with Mukul, and I will whiz right through that so that you all are not subjected to repeats. And some of it is complementary, I would say. So a little background that even comes before Mukul's presentation is just sort of what the Bureau of Labor Statistics says about the growing demand. And this is, of course, based on the current job situation. But after removing those who are graduating and retiring, these are the estimates of what the gaps are going to be in the workforce that BLS puts out. So 2019 to 2029. And as you can see, the direct care workforce is really where we have a major problem in this country. But RNs, our registered nurses, are the second group. And here we have about 222,000 nurse shortfall. Just so you can see some of the other occupations in healthcare as well. You can see PTs, some of the aides, speech pathologists, and so on. So that's sort of the backdrop. Historically, we see that foreign educated healthcare workers have played a huge part in our healthcare system, although perhaps not as large as in Europe. And I'm not sure what the numbers are in Canada. But you can see that the support care is about 22%. I think the support jobs, those generally are not recruited. In fact, CGFNS doesn't even cover them. And that's because there's no margin for the for-profit industry that works in this space. And so those are mostly people who come over of their own accord or are already here. And where you see big money is in the higher educated occupations. And so you see here that RNs are, depending on how you do the calculations, estimated about 15% of the RN workforce is foreign educated. And you can see here that others as well. Physicians and surgeons are actually higher. They are not internationally recruited because they have to go through this bottleneck in the United States, which is called a residency. And so those are usually university to academic medical center negotiated arrangements. And there's very little, if any, room for our entrepreneurial colleagues in the recruitment industry, which is a good thing for physicians. This is a cycle. It's really devastating to source countries that it's so cyclical because they can't plan. And just as, thousands of young people go into nursing in order to be able to migrate, and we know that, Canada, the UK, and the US are at the top of their dream list. Oftentimes, at least in the United States, we shut down the pipeline, and that has devastating effects for them, many of whom have high student debts. And perhaps the only silver lining is that those, particularly in the RN case, we know that at least in India and in the Philippines, which are two major source countries, it's led to all kinds of nurse organizing and even the creation of a nurse political party in the Philippines. So they've tried to protect their rights in their home country when they're unable to leave, because obviously that wasn't part of their original plan. But this fluctuation is really disruptive to source countries. I think everybody agrees that individuals have the right to migrate, but there are also problems in terms of the inability for them to plan their own workforce as a result of this fluctuating demand that we have in the North. So we've already covered the models. I would just say here that the real bottleneck in the United States are visas. And there's a major lobbying effort from the American Hospital Association and the recruitment industry constantly to get more visas. And a lot of the policy conversation happens on the Hill around what can we get in exchange for visas. So we've seen that beyond the voluntary approach, we've seen that space as a space where we could negotiate some progress in terms of regulation. In other words, we'll give you more visas, but you have to let us regulate a little more closely. Problems have also been covered by Mukul really well, and I agree with all of his list. I think for me, just to cut right to the chase, the linchpin is the breach fee. So the problem is that when you have a required length of a contract, and if you leave before that allotted time, you have to pay a high fee. It basically allows for a whole lot of other bad things to happen because there's no accountability. Suddenly you're using sticks instead of carrots to retain people. And I study the domestic nurse workforce as well, and I will say that there are a lot of these, what I would call bad practices, that are stick practices that try to retain people, have sort of seeped into contract practices since COVID in the United States. For example, there are more and more non-compete clauses, which means that you can't work for another company within X number of miles of the company that you're leaving for a certain amount of time. Sometimes it's 50 miles, sometimes it's 100, but you can imagine if you're, the parent of a young family, that's very disruptive, that you have to move cities in order to continue to earn a living. That's now common also in US contracts. The other one that is increasingly common, that is, I think, sort of picked up from the bad habits of the international recruitment industry, are what we call in the United States TRAPs, the Training Repayment Agreement provisions. So new nurses coming out of school are not necessarily entirely work ready. Every hospital over the course of the history of healthcare does a lot of on-the-job training. Hospitals are now requiring that nurses sign an agreement to pay back those costs if they don't stay for more than X number of years. 2 years is a standard, and so that is also obviously being challenged in court. But there's a lot of interest on the part of the private employers in doing that. Other kinds of things are, mandatory overtime, threats of deportation, unsafe staffing conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of problems. But for me, a really important linchpin is the breach fee, which takes away mobility, which means that they can use sticks instead of carrots to try to retain you. So I have not done research on the prevalence of this for a while. Mukul has, but when we did do it back in 2010 and 11, actually this data in a partnership with CGFNS, we found that about half of nurses coming into the country were experiencing one or more violation, and that about a quarter were experiencing two. I think that the problems get worse when the situation is when the market tightens up. We also were able to confirm with regression analyses that nurses coming from low-income countries, as opposed to from the UK, Canada, or other high-income countries, were more likely to suffer violations of the code. Again, to the issue of the linchpin, the nurses that had breach fees, which were pretty much all of the people coming from the global south, were more likely to suffer a violation. And there was weak evidence, but in the regression model, in the direction that those who were employed by staffing agencies were more likely to suffer a violation versus those who were directly hired. And obviously those who arrive in the United States without knowing anything about the terms of their contract, which often happens because sometimes they don't get copies of their contract, were more likely to experience a violation. So I've been really interested, and as Mukul said, I was involved in creating the code way back when. I'm so proud of the work that Mukul has done and CGF has done to try to ensure that the code has as much enforceability as possible, and that the code itself has teeth. But as he said, it's the whole idea is that it's the common ground. And so the common ground when you're dealing with recruiters and the American Hospital Association means they're not willing to budge on breach fees. So we also believe, and consistent with what Mukul thinks, we need to sort of attack this from all angles. We need policy recommendations, and we need the courts to weigh in. And so a real turning point in all of this was with the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, which is a federal statute, which is really important because recruiters tend to locate in sort of employer-friendly states like Ohio and Florida, where the state law around contracts is very favorable to the employer and not the worker. And so this is a federal law that is a lot harder for them to wiggle out of. And there are two provisions that have been used in the case of a lot of nurses, and that we're hoping will really help change the business model in the recruitment industry. One is this idea that you cannot knowingly provide or obtain labor or services of a person by means of a serious harm or threat of harm. And here, the breach fee, we're learning in many of these cases, constitutes a serious threat of harm. And so that is sort of the key element. The other is the right of those affected to bring civil suit against the employer who is doing this. So both they have standing in court. So that has been a real game changer. So I just want to, this is coming from folks who work on trafficking in all areas, but we know that there have been 675 federal civil cases filed under the trafficking law since 2003. Interestingly, most of them are in the area of forced labor. So when you think of trafficking, you often think of sex trafficking, but most of it is in the area of forced labor. And if you look specifically at how much is in healthcare, we see that of the 37 cases that alleged labor trafficking, more than 1 in 5 involved allegations of forced labor in the medical field, with agriculture coming in second. So we are smack in the middle of this phenomenon, even though we didn't know it. So here's just a few of the cases. This was the first, 2015, where they basically were able to establish, this was a pretty egregious case. It was not the typical business model case by any means, but they were basically able to establish that the nurses were brought in, their labor was controlled under the threat of deportation. So the threat was the severe harm in this case. But more importantly, there have been a series of cases subsequently that basically take what the liquidated damages clause within the contracts and describe it as a penalty. And it's a penalty that is not enforceable under the law and violates the TVPA. So suing nurses, what happens is when nurses leave, and they often do leave, especially if they've been benched with no pay, what happens is that nurses tend to fall through the cracks in our country because they make too much money to sort of qualify for free legal aid, and they don't earn enough money to be able to pay the exorbitant legal fees to get a lawyer. So often they just sort of try to disappear. And what happens when the company sues them is that the court then orders their wages to be garnished. So there, we think hundreds of nurses whose wages are being garnished because they didn't have the wherewithal to stand up for their rights. So that was the first case. Then we had a second case again where they looked at liquidated damages provisions amount to a form of forced labor. So this is getting more and more specific and more interesting. And then in addition to the liquidated damages in a case against Health Carousel that was allowed to proceed, they looked at the non-compete clauses and the bait and switch behaviors of you're going to work here, but you end up working somewhere else as violations. So again, these are really getting at the heart of the business model. In the case of Vidal versus Advanced Case Care Staffing, what we're seeing is that even if the breach fees are low, and this is where the CGFNS voluntary code basically does allow a breach fee if it's reasonable, but reasonable isn't defined. So in this case, they're saying that no numerical floor for what financial penalty can give rise to serious harm. Instead, the focus is on the effect that the financial penalties have on the worker. So that's super interesting and hopefully something that, that the code is taking a look at. And then this one is the last one I'll mention. This is the Department of Labor itself suing an international nurse recruitment firm. And their argument is not under the trafficking, but their argument is under the Fair Labor Standards Act, that the breach fee constitutes a kind of clawback of wages and essentially means that the nurses are earning less than minimum wage. And so this is a sort of interesting strategy. It was used before the case of some teacher recruitment or national teacher recruitment effectively. But in particular, I was sort of stunned by, sorry about that, by the DOL press release. And just because it's so exciting to hear government actually say these things, I'm going to read it. This was a flagrantly disregarded federal law by requiring employees to complete at least 3 years of full-time employment to keep their earned wages. The contracts would and allegedly did force employees who left the contracts expired into private arbitration and require them to pay future profits, the company's future profits, plus attorney fees and arbitration costs. These demands would lead and allegedly led to employees being paid less than minimum federal wage. And let me move the thing on my screen so I can read the rest. Federal law forbids employers from clawing back wages earned by employees. So now we see that the government is saying that breach fees is clawing back wages. And it's forbidden under federal law, in particular because employers cannot use workers as insurance policies to unconditionally guarantee future profit streams. So this is all about, frankly, a range of tools that are being used in the United States to retain workers that are, to put it in sort of crude terms, sticks rather than carrots. So this was particularly interesting to me to see this language coming straight out of the government. So, you know, in terms of policy recommendations, my colleague Adam Pulver, who's at Public Citizen, and I wrote a piece in the New England Journal recently where we suggested to Congress that if you're going to give these companies more visas, you should do 5 things. You should basically bar breach fees. You should limit the contracts to 1 year. You should make sure the nurses have a job offer at a specific place before they're allowed to come. And you should make sure that they start work within 1 week and that their pay starts within 1 week. And they can, in other words, they can't be benched. And that the contract should not prohibit nurses from bringing legal claims against their employers in any court that they would have jurisdiction. I will say we didn't get a lot of support from Congress on this, but we keep banging the drum and it's out there, and we think that this would be the right thing to do to put an end to this stuff once and for all. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. Fascinating to see the different strategies and the different legal cases being brought forward to try and address some of these cases. So next we'll move to our third speaker, James Buchan, who will talk about the situation in the UK.
Thanks very much, Margaret. Good morning, everyone in the Americas. Good afternoon, colleagues in Europe. Good evening, anyone from further east who's listening in. I've got 12 minutes, and my intention really is to try and give you a fairly broad, high-level perspective on what's been happening in relation to policy and practice for recruitment of international nurses into the UK over the last 10 to 20 years, with a particular focus on the immediate issues around the last 3 or 4 years post-COVID. In terms of a structure for my presentation, I'm going to begin just by setting out some of the policy context, being aware that we are 4 countries, United Kingdom, each of which is a National Health Service, which is by far the major recruiter and employer of nurses. So there is quite a close alignment between government as sponsor for the NHS and government as determinant on broader immigration policy. And one of the themes I'll come back to is that there's not always been perfect alignment between those 2 intentions. Pick up on something that already has been touched on by others, the impact of COVID on the workforce, particularly nursing, then look at trends and recent dynamics in terms of international recruitment of nurses, then finish with really looking at some of the unfinished business and policy considerations, which hopefully prompt questions from the audience. So there's two elements I just want to flag up on in terms of policy context. And this is, I'm talking about England here, which is by far the largest of the 4 UK countries. Two separate issues. Firstly, in the run-up to the 2019 election, which is the last general election, the Conservative Party made an electoral commitment to have 50,000 more nurses in the NHS by the end of the lifetime of the Parliament. They were elected, and we are coming towards the end of the lifetime of that 5-year Parliament. And I'll keep you in suspense and wait till the end of my presentation to tell you whether or not that target has been met. That's the reason that's in brackets, is it's not related to the major issues on the slide, which is that earlier this year, for the first time in a long time, the National Health Service in England published a complete long-term workforce plan. I'm not going to go through even the detail on this slide, but just to recognize we're talking about a workforce of nearer 1.3 to 1.5 million, just to give you context. A recognition in terms of projections, unless there was a rapid increase in recruitment and improvement in retention, the current vacancies and shortages would go up to as much as 250,000 by 2036. And therefore, what they were looking at doing in terms of a plan was a lot of investment in increasing the numbers coming through domestic training. And also, in terms of the context for this current discussion, a commitment to significantly reduce the reliance on international recruitment. So that really is the background context. We have a government that made a commitment to 50,000 more nurses, and more recently, an all-encompassing National Health Service plan, which sets out very ambitious growth targets, but also says that we need to look at reducing reliance on international recruitment. Next few slides are all graphs, so that's easy for the audience, easy for me because it's after 5 p.m. where I am. All drawn from OECD, most recent data published in November this year. Really put this up to put the UK in context on some significant metrics. So this is the first a crude measure of access, nurses per 100,000 population. The UK is just there to the right of the OECD average, which is the red-black slide. So we're below OECD average. And also, if you look at the shift between the white circle and the green circle, which shows change over a 10-year period, we did not report much in terms of growth, whereas some other countries have seen a much larger growth. Second measure, what's the replacements looking like? How many nursing graduates per population? OECD average in the middle there, UK just below average. Having said that, it seems to have gone up a lot in the last couple of years, whereas probably the sort of countries that the UK population at large would be aspiring to compare with are further left. Australia, for example, is graduating round about 3 times as many nurses per year as the UK. Specific issue that we're talking about really today, this is a measure of stock, the share of foreign trade nurses. What percentage of the current overall workforce came from foreign training rather than domestic training? UK is 5th top there, round about 1 in 5 nurses is foreign trained. You can see there the OECD average 8.7. Big variation across the OECD, and it's pretty obvious, for example, that the countries above the average include most of the high income Anglophone or Anglo-Francophone countries in the OECD. So that gives you a background sense in which, in comparison, the UK appears slightly below average in terms of nurse availability, low in terms of replacement numbers, and relatively high current reliance on international nurses. Next couple of slides, I'm looking more specifically at what has happened in relation to COVID, post-COVID impact on labour market behaviour in the National Health Service. This looks at the leaver rates across the period since 2010, and very nicely illustrates what happened, which is when COVID hit in 2020, many workers stayed at work, came back to work, worked extra hours, turnover reduced because people were very committed to working where they were and or couldn't move anyway. But what's happened since is we've then seen a spike upwards in terms of labour rates, partly probably because of pent up turnover that couldn't happen in 2020. But also we're hearing reports, I know it's not just the UK, of higher levels of burnout, nurses looking to reduce hours, retire early, and in some cases look to move to other countries. So the anecdotes around here are backed up by the data that we have seen a suppression and then increase in terms of mobility and leaving rates. Second COVID impact, what I've got here, and probably particularly at the yellow column, which shows the domestic applications to nursing as an undergraduate entry in the UK across the period since 2019. And essentially what has happened is there was a kind of halo effect towards the end of the first year of COVID, when nurses got very good press, media coverage. More people got interested in coming into the profession, but that has now dropped back quite markedly. We've had the first ever national nursing strikes this last year in England. There have been big concerns about the fact nurses' pay earnings have not progressed as rapidly as other sectors. So I think there are factors you can point to that explain this reduction in interest. So in sort of collection of events there, COVID has increased demand because care demand is up, but has begun to impact negatively on current availability of nurses, potentially also, if you look at this graph, at future domestic availability. What I'm going to do now is shift to looking specifically at international recruitment. This is a data set that myself and colleagues at the Health Foundation have developed, and it gives us an annual picture back to around about 1990 up to the current day. On an annual basis, what it's showing here is how many non-UK educated nurses came onto the UK register for the first time. So essentially, it's a reasonably good way of tracking the numbers of nurses coming into work in the UK on a long-term basis. Very, very clear, distinct pattern. We did have a spike in numbers in the early 2000s, which related to government investment to expand the NHS and the requirement to have more nurses and other health workers. That then dropped back, but also related to greater reliance on nurses from the European Union. Beyond the Brexit vote, that has switched back, and as you can see, those graphs have gone up inexorably year on year in the last few years, and we're now at historic levels of numbers of nurses coming in from other countries. And I think probably we are at the moment the highest level in terms of any OECD country in terms of inflow of nurses. Another way of looking at that data is to compare domestic with international. So this is the column for every year showing the proportion of nurses who come from UK education, which is green, and international, which is red. And again, looking at that, you can see that ebb and flow. reinforcing the point about dynamics and really making a very strong case for active recruitment around about 2000, 2001, 2, spiking the numbers internationally, but more recently we're seeing the same thing. So round about half the nurses in the last year have come onto the register from other sources, other countries. Going to pick up on the ethical issue here. WHO Code of Practice on International Recruitment of Health Personnel, 2010, signed by all member states. It's voluntary, but it places an emphasis on ethical international recruitment. I won't read through all these points in detail, but there's a cluster of aspects that WHO argues should be there in terms of ethical recruitment. And more recently, they have appended a list of countries to the code which should not be the target for active international recruitment. There are at the moment about, I think, 53 or 54, mainly sub-Saharan Africa. Looking at that list and looking at UK activity, my colleagues and myself at Health Foundation have looked at the trend in the number of nurses coming onto the UK register from so-called red list countries. And as you can see, that's ramped up rapidly to more than 6,000 in the last year, mainly from Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and other sub-Saharan African countries. Now, the issue here in terms of what we mean by ethics is those who are recruiting these nurses argue that they are not actively recruiting. The word active is the important one here, because the nurses are individually making the running to come to work in the UK and or are responding to website recruitment, which is regarded as passive, not active. I think that is something that we can argue, we can debate, but the reality is the data, and it's showing there that the UK has a very significant footprint in terms of impact and numbers coming from sub-Saharan Africa. Just a couple of slides to finish. Unfinished business. I've talked about the National Health Service. If you look at the social care sector, which is parallel, there are something like 150,000 vacancies in that area. Picking up on some of what's already been said, there are issues there, particularly with low pay. They're very heavily reliant also on international recruitment. And my last slide will come back to this in terms of some changes in migration policy, which are going to negatively impact inflow to social care. We've got the ongoing strikes, which no longer for nurses, but doctors are still, in fact, they're planning, I think it's a 9-day strike over the Christmas period. So there's a lot of negative chatter, shall we say, around at the moment. In terms of the long-term workforce plan, analysis done by colleagues at Health Foundation has shown that if we are to meet the targets for domestic training increase, this has to increase overall by about 50%, from 1 in 9 to about 1 in 6. If you factor that against the data showing reduced interest in particularly nursing in terms of applications to undergraduate domestic education, big challenges there. And that relates also to the same capacity constraints as I know exist in other Canada, US, and other countries. Have we got enough tutors? Have we got enough clinical placements? Can university expand their intakes? Those sort of pragmatic questions need to be addressed also. Final slide. It was announced a couple of weeks ago by government that it has met the 50,000 nurse target. Interestingly, and this literally was announced yesterday in a media coverage, that 93% of that 50,000 target came from international recruitment. So essentially, the domestic growth has been channeled via international recruitment. If we hadn't had active international recruitment, we probably would not be meeting the target. What comes through very strongly in the analysis that myself and others are doing is that we can track nurses when they come on the register, but we have very poor data on where they're working when they move. And I know that's an issue for other countries. That needs to improve if we're going to get on top of the issue of what active recruitment looks like. The long-term workforce plan, as I said, assumes a reduction in active international recruitment, whereas at the moment, everything is pointing in the other direction. So big policy questions there. How can we make processes more effective through fast tracking, the sort of thing Mukul was talking about earlier? Last week, there was a government announcement that on the broad immigration policy, they're going to require an earnings threshold, which is higher than before for people to migrate in. And these individuals will no longer be allowed to bring partner or family, which inevitably, when you're looking at carers, I think is going to be very challenging. So there's a general government policy on immigration change that looks like it will undermine some of the intent around active recruitment in care and National Health Service. Question about red list countries, and we're very prominent there. To what extent is that a reputational risk? And finally, really a point here about joined up government in terms of immigration policy, international recruitment policy, and international development and aid policy. They don't always look as though they're as well joined up or aligned as they should be. Thanks very much for your attention. I've jumped through that quite quickly, but hopefully figures are better than words, and it's stuck with you. I also apologize for looking a bit grayscale. I just couldn't get the lighting right today, so look forward to some Q&A. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Okay, wonderful. And now our final presenter is Ruth Lee, who's the Executive Director of CARE. And this will give us an interesting observation from Ontario, from Canada. CARE works with internationally educated nurses in assisting them to get into, to have their credentials recognized and get into practice. So Ruth, over to you.
Okay, Margaret, I presume that you see my slides, okay?
Yes, they look great.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, whatever I have to say is very similar to the previous colleagues. So let me see if I can, okay, there you go. So post-pandemic challenges is huge because Canada, with the aging population, the Canadian Nurses Association already predicting a 60,000 nursing shortage in 2021, I believe, in the year 2000, and then things kind of get worse, and then with the pandemic basically caught the whole world unexpected. So we have unprecedented demand of nursing, human resources, and it's just making things really challenging to ensure that patients are safe. And that crisis actually created a lot of opportunities for internationally educated nurses. So all of a sudden, it's not that the IEN been with Canada for a short time. They've been there for many years, particularly those from the Philippines and recently from India. But all of a sudden, with the crisis, then the IENs, with their global clinical, linguistic, and cultural expertise, really make it shine at that point when we realized that Canada being a very multicultural, multilingual country, so all of a sudden the IENs were under the spotlight, and we are taking a full advantage of basically making sure the IENs are nurses. So the reason why I say that is that to me personally, as a nurse, I find it very unethical that we have many internationally educated nurses who end up not working as nurses because of the tedious and unnecessary barriers that we have created for them, all the way from credentialing recognition to clinical recognition and linguistic requirements. So over the past 3 years, we see a lot of improvement in that area, starting with government incentives, covering the exams, costs, preparation for the exams, and also registration fees for international educated nurses, and also designated funding for the employers to integrate IENs so that they can come in to do work, job shadow a nurse, and so on. So a lot of creative and innovative ways that become available to the IEN to integrate them into the Canadian healthcare system. So this streamlining the registration process also result in a record number of IENs in the Canadian regulatory body history. For example, in the past, each individual will be assessed independently. So I never stop telling the story about a husband and wife that they graduate from the same school, they fall in love, they work together, and then the wife stay frontline, but the husband pursue his graduate studies, become an educator, and guess what? The husband was not deemed equivalent and not current because everybody have to write the entrance exam the same way. And for someone who been basically removed and get more specialized from the front line, they are a huge disadvantage. While the wife in this scenario stay at the front line and in no time, looking at months, while the husband take years and end up that he become a RPN, or we call the licensed practical nurse, or in the UK system enrolled nurse, rather than a registered nurse that we need badly in the current crisis of nursing human resources. So when you look at the Canadian data, the Canadian Institute for Health Information, for the past 10 years, 25 nurses have migrated to Canada. And my UK colleague just showed that that's 8.6% of Canada's regulated health nursing supplies IEN. So now actually the most recent I see is 8.9. I would expect that proportion will be a little higher when you look at the more recent data, looking at maybe early next year, because of the process being streamlined and making a lot easier. So right now, RN making up 46% of the net increase, and in 2020, and that you can see the huge increase from 19% of net increase in 2021. So closer home to me is the province of Ontario. So the College of Nurses Ontario, again, unprecedented number of our IENs. So one will wonder what happened to all these people in the past when they are not being utilized as nurses because of all the barriers that we as a country set up for them to enter the nursing profession. So these increases I show you is not for those actively recruitment that people may send a recruiter out and things like that. This is mainly capitalized on nurses who are already in the country and doing things that are absolutely below their skill set as nurses. So here's what happened in the past few years, 5 years. Basically, the majority of those years, as you can see, are the COVID years. So you can see the number that I just show you, the percentage, unprecedented. As I said, I have my registration with the College of Nurses Ontario for a few decades now, and this is the first time we see this kind of number. And I will expect this number to decrease because basically we more or less exhaust the pool of people who've been waiting to become nurses in this country, because in Ontario we have a 3-year timeline. If you're not working for 3 years, you're deemed not current, and then you basically have to do a lot of makeup or go back to school and things like that. So here is the registration requirement in Ontario, very similar in other provinces of Ontario. So as you folks have heard yesterday, that from my Canadian colleagues, health, including health, human resources, is more or less a provincial responsibility. So, but luckily for these past few years, other than the province of Quebec, most of the provinces, as well as the territories, basically write the same exam, the NCLEX exam, and very similar requirements. So what you're seeing in front of you are very similar requirements for people, for international educated nurses and also local early educated nurses to get their license, because without that license, they cannot practice as a nurse. And many of them end up doing work that well below their skill set and ability. And as I said, to me, this is a very unethical issue, not allowing people to practice to their full scope. So as you can see, we have the Supervised Practice Experience Partnership, SPAP, we call them. And it's because of some of the individuals who lapsed their safe practice of 3 years. I still remember the day I advocate on the IEN's behalf through the regulator body to say that the whole world come to a halt right now. No plane is flying anywhere, because previously, if they left the 3 years window, they will fly back to their home country, practice for 140 hours or however long the college deemed that they need to do, and they will come back and meet that evidence of practice requirement, and they get their license to practice. But when the whole world come to halt, what are we going to do? So anyway, the conclusion is that we set up as PAP so that we allow international educated nurses to practice in our own healthcare organizations, hospitals, community health centers, home care, and so on, so that they meet that requirement and it can be full-blown nurses. And currently, there's a new development as well, is the temporary registration class. So everything being met, as you can see the check mark on the screen here, and they are just needing to have their education requirement verified, or their and they will need to write their NCLEX, and then once they pass, they will be full-blown nurses. But at the meantime, they can practice under supervision of another registered nurse, except the Control Acts. Then they can do basically everything under supervision. And then, of course, at the right-hand side here, you see the general class, and then you have to meet all these 8 requirements so that you can be practicing. So that is the goal, that we need to make sure the nurses are safe, that we want to make sure that patient safety are being protected, but at the meantime, we allow the nurses to practice with full scope, and we launch their career in Canada. And Canada, I would say, very, very fortunate to have this international talent come to this land, and we owe it to them provide ethical support and guidance so that they can fully integrate into our healthcare system. So Care Center for Internationally Educated Nurses is a non-profit, government-funded charitable organization. We started in 2001 when we have a nursing shortage crisis. And since then, we have developed into provincial service that support nurses to get their license, making sure that the credentialing system is in place, making sure their clinical expertise and meeting the regulatory requirements, support them through exams, help them get a job, and also making sure that a year after they get the license, they are being supported, because many of them are also new immigrants. As we all know, they need a lot of settlement support in addition to their professional support. In 2016, we also established a pre-arrival program, so that this is a pan-Canadian program that we want to make sure before nurses come to Canada, they already started the process of getting their registration papers, their credentialing verified by the National Nursing Assessment Services and so on, so that they don't come here with no license. As I said, they cannot work as nurses. So we want to start them early. So right now, we have close partnership across the country to support nurses pre-arrival, and we have many, many partners provincially to support nurses already in Ontario. So this is the model that we work with. As you can see, the IEN is in the middle, at the center of our focus, and we have a case management model. What that means is that they all assign a case manager. This one go-to person will walk with them, coach them to make sure that they can ask questions, they be directed in the right path, so they're not wasting time or money, because right now, as I mentioned, we are government funded, so they don't have to worry about financial situations. And we also have many partners with employers, academic institutions, and professional organizations to support them. So this is the process. So I don't expect you to read all the detail, but the three circle that you can see, these are the processes that we kept to help them navigate the credentialing processes, and also have educational programs to support them to meet those gaps. And if we cannot meet those the requirements, we will refer them to academic institutions, and we work with partners very closely. And as I mentioned, for a whole year, we follow them post-registration to make sure that they integrate appropriately. And we also have a very comprehensive workplace integration program that is not just targeting IENs. For those of you familiar with the literature, we basically expect the IENs to do all the preparation themselves. And to us, this is a two-way street. It's almost like you need to plant the seed in the right kind of soil with the right kind of climate for them to flourish. However tough you make the seed to become, it's not going to do anything unless you have a welcoming soil and the right kind of climate and water and sunshine to let the flower bloom. So this is basically the processes that we do at Care Center to support the IENs in collaboration with many of our partners. So again, just a recap, the fourth focus is the communication and workplace integration. Many of them, as you can see, the top 10 countries, majority of them speak English as a second language. So right now, communication, not just language, but that's how you communicate also make a difference in the clinical area, and patient safety is at stake if communication is an issue. Nursing knowledge and skills, as I mentioned, some of them may need to be more familiar with what kind of equipment we use, and also the licensure, examination preparation, employment and career development. So many nurses come here, they're very lost. They don't know where to turn. And we become that bridge for them to support them. So we're very proud that last month we have a graduation of just under 600 internationally educated nurses. Why we call them graduation? Because they come from another country. We want them to feel that now their school is not here with them, Care Center become their school. So once they receive their registration to practice, we gather them and we call that their graduation. So we're very honored that this past month, we have a 2023 celebration of them achieving the registration. We have our chief nurse of the land, Dr. Lee Chapman, and also the provincial chief nurse, Karima Valje, come to graduation, send their words of encouragement and so on. And then we have our valedictorian, a nurse from the Philippines. So I mentioned about the employment support, just give you a taste of what we do. We basically engage the employer to get them to meet the employer, get them to visit the site, and get them to apply. Actually, some employer want them to apply right then and there. And before that, we're also making sure that they have the right kind of interview skills. Because many countries, once you graduate from nursing school, you do not go through that process. You will have a job waiting for you. But here, you have to sell yourself, which is very strange language for many of the IENs. So we're basically making sure that their cover letter, their CV, and when they interview, they do it properly. I often tease our IEN members, looking at my beautiful new shoes is not going to get you the job. Because many IENs are very humble for them to look people in the eye, which in North America is a common thing to show that you're confident. Looking in the eye for many cultures, it's very disrespectful. So many IENs do not get their jobs because the employer feedback is that I don't think I can trust this nurse. He or she didn't even look me in the eye. So all this nitty gritty. So I'm all the way bringing folks from the macro data that you've been hearing yesterday and today to basically on the ground level. So that's what we do to support them. across the province, we also partner with many provinces, as I mentioned earlier. So this is one example. We presented at the International Council of Nurses Congress this past summer, just showcasing on the work that we do across the country, supporting different provinces in recruitment, retention, and integration of internationally educated nurses. So these two examples from Saskatchewan, as well as Nova Scotia, the East Coast. So, so what do we do, and what I will recommend?
If I could just ask you to wrap up, Ruth, so we have a bit of time for questions.
Okay, right. So basically, it's a two-way street, and I would suggest that we basically need to work collaboratively with organizations and IENs. And so we give very practical strategies for employers in integrating the IENs and making sure that we are very respectful, that we will work with them rather than just give them whatever you think is appropriate, meeting your needs. So my conclusion is that we need to follow the International Council of Nurses position in ethical nursing recruitment, systematic approach to integration, and that including the settlement agencies is not just the employer alone. And also provide IENs and the healthcare team with conflict management trainings, because we see a lot of unpleasant relationships just because of cultural differences and misunderstanding. And also we need to continually do regular assessments and make changes. And we need to share lessons learned, and like what we do today. So I thank Margaret for having me to be part of this very important conference. Thank you so much. So this is my correspondence. So I stopped sharing my screen.
Thank you so much to everyone for their presentations. Some were slightly over, and that's okay because you were all about the same amount of being slightly over, other than Mukul. So Mukul gets a gold star for being the shortest presentation. Well done. While the audience thinks of some questions, I just want to indicate we have a few questions online and a few comments, so I'll just share them. Andre Galepi says that there will be a WHO guidance document on agreements on health worker migration and mobility that will be expanding on the WHO code, and that will be published in the next few months. So keep an eye out for that. It's been developed collaboratively with the ILO and the OECD, and it will include key policy considerations on workforce sustainability, health system benefit safeguards, supports to vulnerable countries, and so on. So that will be something interesting to look out for. There is another question from Andre. Oh, and also saying, hang on, they're all changing as I'm looking at them. Looks like our panelists have been answering them. Thank you so much for doing that while we have been here. And while the audience thinks of their questions, I will take the prerogative of being the facilitator for this session to ask a question of all of the panelists if they'd like to respond. What I found interesting in some of, as you were presenting, was to think about and I mean, often the position of regulators and health workforce planners and researchers is to recognize the right of people to migrate and to recognize the value that internationally educated nurses bring to the health workforce in many different contexts. But I would be interested to hear from panelists about where they do see there are some sort of interactions occurring between the policies and processes that are kind of structuring international nurse recruitment and integration. And I was thinking of this when Polly was presenting on some of the bad practices in the international contracts sort of seeping into regular practices, such as the widespread use of like non-compete clauses. And then also in the case of the UK, Jim, the most recent government policies on salary caps, where they have made an exception for the health workforce sector, suggests that the UK government is not necessarily then interested in making the working conditions for domestic staff more improved, because they're using this exemption to allow themselves to sort of bypass some of those. And then Ruth, in your presentation, you talked about the temporary class, the supervised practice, where where really there's an expectation of mentoring that is dependent on often sort of domestic workforces that may not necessarily be adequately compensated or supported by employers. And so I wondered if you have any comments on what you see of those interactions between an increasing dependence on internationally recruited nurses and some of the more broad work scale processes that might be underway.
Thank you, Margaret. This is so true, and that's why in my slides I mentioned about conflict management. Because as you can imagine, at the front line, the workload is horrendous as it is. So increasingly you find a lot of conflict, and people just have no time to coach or to guide, and then this issue about, oh, my license on the line. Right? If something go wrong with this IEN, will my license on the line? So all those concerns is very real, and many nurses local may not willing to take on the IEN as a preceptor. And having said that, it's not just IENs, nursing students as well. So we have increased enrollment of nursing students by about 30% this past few years since COVID. So you will see an increase in workforce in the next year because it's a 4-year program, but we have a huge challenge finding preceptors. So at Care Center, we have what we call the expert nurses. So what we have done is that we help the employers to recruit internationally educated nurses who've been working for a long time in the Canadian system to basically try to get them to remember how hard it is to be a newcomer. And we are very fortunate that many of those nurses come forward to take on IENs and to help them meet those requirements of able to get their temporary license, as well as fulfilling that requirement 140 hours minimum to get their license to refresh their practice.
Great, thank you for that. Polly.
Well, I mean, I think the kind of work that Ruth does is so important to preventing this surge in international recruitment that we're seeing in all 3 countries from contributing to kind of a race to the bottom in terms of worker conditions and standards. And so that's been the concern in the United States from the last, the early 2000s, when there was also a surge in recruitment, which is that we are essentially creating 2 classes of nurses in this country. And that's not helping anybody. It's not helping domestic nurses, and it's not helping international nurses, and it's not helping patients because it creates conflict. So I think that to this issue of what's the effect overall, it's just essential. You can debate the question of the red list countries and how to handle that. You can debate even the issue of the cyclical nature of the surge and how that yanks source countries, and in particular nurses and their family in source countries' lives around when they train to come and then you don't want them after all, or when you're demanding so many that they can't keep up and they're closing hospitals. Either way, those things are complicated, but I don't think it's complicated to say we have to make sure that to the extent that this happens, that they're integrated in ways that they have exactly the same rights as domestic nurses. And in the case of the United States, it's quite different than the UK and Canada. But I think that in the case of, because it's driven by these entrepreneurial practices and there's so much for-profit sort of motivation around it. But I think that, there are other more subtle forms of exploitation that happen perhaps in Canada and the UK around, promotions and interpersonal relationships and those kinds of things that are also important. But I think we should all, as workforce policy researchers, really keep an eye on this question of avoiding this phenomenon of being a race to the bottom, because we're also facing an exodus of U.S. and of domestic workers, right? They're burnt out, they're leaving, but the reason they're leaving is because of unsafe staffing and because of poor working conditions and lack of control over the patient care that they provide. Those are the challenges that domestic workers are facing. And so it's really important. And I think in the United States, to the credit of the labor movement is growing extremely rapidly in the United States, but it's still only, I don't know, 10% of the workforce is organized. But they have, unlike the last time in the early 2000s that this occurred, they do understand the importance of making sure that nurses coming in are embraced and helped to sort of ensure that their working conditions are the same as others. And I think there's less of a, I don't think anybody's assuming that there's not a need for these nurses. They understand that there's a need. It's just a question of how do we integrate them. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a better conversation going on now than there was 20 years ago.
Great, thank you. Jim.
Great question. I'll respond to it in three quick elements. Firstly, I didn't have time when I talked about the 50,000 target to get into detail, but I think one of the critical issues there is that it wasn't planning based. It doesn't say we need this type of nurse and we want them working here or there. It was just a blanket target. And therefore was relatively easy to meet through international recruitment, because many of our vacancies, which are in primary care, community care, learning disabilities, midwifery, don't lend themselves easily to international recruitment. However, because there was no calibration about how that 50,000 should be made up, we went very strong and heavy because it was a government commitment. We made the 50K mainly acute, mainly hospital-based nurses. In terms of ethical approach and ethical recruitment, I think generally speaking, the National Health Service employers comply with the code, they comply with the Department of Health in England's own code. The really bad practice that's been reported in terms of international recruitment is not within the NHS. It's on the margins, it's smaller nursing homes, private sector companies, recruitment agencies in some cases where there's been misleading information or downright lies provided to nurses in terms of what they'll be paid or where they'll work. But I do think there is a more, one might call it insidious issue, which is if you look at surveys of nurses in the NHS, you'll find that international nurses are often less likely to be promoted, less likely to have access to career development, more likely to stay in the kind of basic pay grade for longer. And that does, I think, raise some obvious questions about what's really going on there. So I think the worst practice is not obvious in the NHS, but there are issues that do continue to be addressed. Final point, you did mention the salary cap in relation to continued immigration. And without getting too much into the detail, the initiatives announced last week, one of which is to raise the salary cap apart from in health and care. Clearly, it's not going to impact directly on immigration from health and care workers. But the other element of it, which is you can't come with family or partner, I think will. But what we don't yet know, we haven't had time to unpack what that means in terms of proportion of recent inflow. What it does show is a current government which has factions within it, some of which are very anti-immigration. And at the moment, they are gaining some traction. So that's why we're seeing some of these new changes being announced. And
Jim, can I just ask a clarifying question? Are these temporary visas or are they permanent visas?
These would normally be temporary in the first case. And is
that a point of dispute in the UK that folks want permanent immigration visas?
Not generally, because the normal process is that if you come in on a temporary, which is often for 3 years, there'll then be scope to extend it and perhaps become permanent or resident in a longer time period. That's not really been the issue. It's more about the criteria for getting into the country in the first place and the changes that are occurring reasonably rapidly at the moment. I think, as I said, reflecting broader political dynamics within government, and we've got the run-up to the election as well.
Okay, we've got like 5 minutes left, and I have a question in the room and a question online, but I do want to let Mukul perhaps respond if he wants to in terms of this question, just briefly.
Perfect. I think I agree with what everyone said. I'll just keep it quick and add one kind of wrinkle here, which is that the last couple of years has been very disruptive within the recruitment industry itself. Canada, which didn't see recruiters, now has some, and there have been tons of new market entrants, entrepreneurs who have no exposure to labor and what that means entering, and that has led to a lot of issues in terms of both contract practices, but also integration. They just haven't had the same support, a lot of nurses in the last couple of years, that they might have from a kind of an old school staffing firm. And so the kind of disruptions there have kind of implications for both the integration question and ethical recruitment.
Great, thank you. Ivy, we have a question in the room.
Great, thank you. Ivy Bergeau. So Jim, you evoked the notion of the WHO code, and I'm just curious about, you know, the relationship between the code, the principles of the code, the work, Mukul, of the Alliance, Ruth, you know, the work of CARE, and I think that there are elements of the principles of the code that are being, you know, exemplified in the work of the Alliance and of CARE. But I'm curious, is the code being worked around? Is it completely ignored and irrelevant? Is it inconvenient during times of crisis? So I'm just curious about that.
I would say that as we speak, the majority export countries of nurses are India and the Philippines. And right now, even these two countries are suffering. But we all know that these two countries basically count on the nurses migrating out of the country and bring back money, you know, even people send money home or whatever. So the colleagues that we work with, employers that we work with, basically embraced the principles through the WHO and also the International Council of Nurses, because they're very much reflective of each other's principles. So this is ethical recruitment is a very key thing. So our Chief Nursing Executive, Dr. Lee Chapman, basically said that the focus for Canada now is retention. Because right now, I believe the Conference Board of Canada recently have a publication called the Leaking Bucket. So if anyone interested, get a hold of it. So we're talking about a large number of internationally health professionals actually come to this country and they don't stay. And I can tell you many our Canadians, nurses actually, Canadian graduates actually go to the US and Australia and so on. And many IENs actually head out to the US as well from Canada. So very much embracing the principles, I think is important. And also some other countries, the integration process is a lot more difficult. As we know, the Filipino nurses, many of them, their curriculum basically mirror the US and Canadian using the same textbook. So we found that it's easier to integrate them than maybe other countries. India is closely second, but other country we find it it's just unfair to have some of those. So we basically capitalize on the permanent residents, the immigrants, and conventional refugees, rather than out there just recruit people actively or overtly.
Okay, thanks, Ruth. Jim.
That's a great question. Thanks, Ivy. Two immediate reflections of that. Firstly, ignorance is no defense, but it's surprising even now when you talk to people that some of them in national positions of power and influence and policy are not aware of WHO code. So I think there's a continuing need to promote it and advocate it. So that'd be number one. Number two, in terms of full compliance or recognition, I did identify the issue of what is active when you talk about active recruitment. And I think that's loose enough to allow things to go on that perhaps WHO did not think would go on. And in part, we're looking at a code that was signed off in 2010. There's much more use of social media, much more use of internet-based recruitment now, and that perhaps is part of the factor. And just to conclude, obviously, the way of checking if the code is effective is to have good monitoring. And one of the continuing challenges is when you look at the bilateral process of each country reporting back to WHO on how the code is doing, we never get a full response. And it's often the countries that probably are most impacted by outflow that are the ones who don't report. So there's that level of missing pieces in the jigsaw as well. Thanks.
And thank you so much. I know there are probably so many more issues and questions, and I'm very grateful to the panelists for answering the questions online. I'd love to have more time to talk about all of these important issues that you've raised, but we are now at our lunch time. We have 45 minutes for lunch. I'm really grateful to our panelists for calling in from wherever they are and whatever time zone they're in. And so I'd like to ask our audience here and online to please share with me this moment of applause for their contributions.